We are now well aware of the 6 technology keys. Now let's go and find the ancient pathways of the first and the master farmer and learn how to implement his ways with a practical and manageable step-by-step procedure that everyone can do.
Walk in it, shine bright, let your glory fill this land. Faith, hope, you know that the blessings are coming. Jesus, you are the way, you are the way. When I think of all your goodness and the ways you've planned before time began.
Field scale farmer tools required. 2 to 4 hoes, sharpen the blades and repair the handles. A 60 centimeter stick for making and calibrating the measuring rope. A measuring rope with 60 centimeter markers, preferably as long as your field, up to a maximum of 50 meters long. A downslope rope, preferably with 75 centimeter markers on it, up to 50 meters long. A large sheet of paper or book to get a right angle. 2 75 centimeter sticks. 30 permanent pegs, 20 centimeters long, to be placed after every 10 rows. Preferably 2 500 ml tins, cups or bowls, 2 teaspoons and 2 tablespoons. Field scale inputs required. Seed, 25 kilograms per hectare for maize. For others, see the alternative crops for guidelines. Wood ash, 5 50 kilogram bags per hectare. When applying 500 ml of organic fertilizer without top dressings, you will need 222 bags per hectare of manure, compost or anthill soil. When applying 350 ml of organic fertilizer with 2 top dressings, you will need 156 bags per hectare of manure, compost or anthill soil and 5 bags of urea or CAN. When applying inorganic fertilizer with 2 top dressings, you will need 6 50 kilogram bags of DAP per hectare or NPK and 5 bags of urea or CAN. Making measuring ropes. Measuring ropes are an essential kit item for farming God's way. We use them to establish permanence, high standard plant population densities and canopy cover. For field scale implementation, the most commonly used rope is the 60 centimeter measuring rope. The 75 centimeter measuring rope is also very valuable for laying out your field, and some of our larger farmers are even using 2 75 centimeter ropes for speed and accuracy. To make a measuring rope, use a non-stretch hardy rope, preferably made out of a decent thickness nylon or cable as long as your field, but up to a maximum of 50 meters in length. When preparing bigger fields, the ropes would simply be extended after completing each quadrant. Tie loops on each end of the rope, peg it in on one side, then pull the rope taut and straight and peg it in on the other side. Either use a long tape measure or a 60 centimeter long stick with which to measure the marking positions with a measuring tape mark or the edge of the stick and attach it firmly. When using pre-cut sticks, simply move the stick down the rope, marking one at a time from center to center. The position of the first marker relative to the corner or loop of the rope is not important, as we will always use the first and the last markers to establish permanence and not the corners. My preferred method is to use 8 to 10 turns of soft wire wound tightly onto the taut rope. Trim the tags flush with the windings and firm with pliers. Another method is to use short plastic strips woven into the rope. First, slacken off one end of the rope and use the 60 centimeter stick to get approximate positions. Then weave the plastic strip into the rope between the threads, but do not tie them off yet. Once all the threads are in approximate position, reattach the loop making sure that the rope is taut and straight. Then start from the beginning again by checking the marker positions using the stick and sliding the threaded plastic strips forwards or backwards into the accurate 60 cm positions. Then tie them off with a double knot and trim the ends shorter. The third option is to use bottle tops crimped onto the rope with pliers. However, in my experience, these markers can slip, so I don't really recommend this. The easiest option is to make your measuring rope when your local Farming God's Way trainer is with you by laying out your new rope next to their 50-meter long measuring rope and simply attach your markers in alignment with the trainer's benchmark rope. Ideally, it is valuable to have 3 field scale measuring ropes, a 60 cm for planting stations for many crops, a 75 for permanence of rows, and a 45 cm measuring rope for certain vegetable production crops. Use a cheap stretchy rope that you can pull very tight to get straight rows for all your furrow crops. It's preferable to start your land preparations approximately 2 months before your planting season begins so that you're ready on time. In the summer rainfall regions of sub-Saharan Africa, start your land preparations at the beginning of September. In Central African countries like Kenya and Uganda, which experience both the long and the short rains, start preparing your lands at the beginning of January for the long rain plantings. Instead of clearing enormous tracts of land, rather start small and do Farming God's Way to a high standard. Let your available inputs that God's given you in manure, compost, anthill or fertilizer determine what land areas you're going to be preparing. You're most likely going to be planting into an old cropland or cover crop field, just like this one in the background, which has been knocked down and made ready for planting. So just make sure that the land is weed-free throughout the off-season. If the land is a jungle of weeds, hoe them down to ground level, leaving them to lie as God's blanket on the surface of the ground. But remove weeds that are still full of seeds. Creeping grasses are the most problematic weeds, and the most effective way to kill them is by smother mulching them with a thick layer of God's blanket. If you don't have enough blankets, then pull out as many of the runners as you can and remove them out of the land. Keep on building up your blanket cover throughout the year so that you can ensure you keep creeping grasses under control. If you are preparing land that's never been farmed before, the soil is already in a prime virgin condition, which has produced beautiful natural vegetation for centuries without plowing or burning. Cut down the trees, destump, and clear the bush, leaving God's blanket made up of leaves and grasses lying on the surface of the ground. Whatever you do, at all costs, do not plow the land or burn God's blanket. Level off the destumped areas and spread God's blanket evenly over the entire field. The forests are a part of God's awesome wonder which we have to actively preserve. Farming God's Way allows such drastic yield improvements that we lower the land demand for sensitive natural forests. God expects us to look after and care for His creation, and by simply increasing our yields per hectare, we don't have to destroy forested areas by using slash and burn agriculture anymore. Maize and bean crops are the most commonly grown staple foods among small-scale farmers in Africa. If you don't grow these crops, follow the same principles of layout and simply adjust the design based on the section Alternative Crop Guidelines. Finding the biggest square. If your garden's not a square or a rectangle and is a strange shape or has pathways that affect its straight edge, don't worry, because there's one inside every shape. Pace out your field and find the very largest square or rectangle within the irregular shape. You will then continue the field layout using this largest square, and at a later stage, fill in the missing pieces by following the rows and in rows until the entire field is fully prepared. Establishing the baseline. Always start at the highest point or the top side of your field within the biggest square and place your 60 centimeter measuring rope across the slope. Hammer in the first corner peg. Then pull the rope taut and straight and hammer in the second corner. This is very important as we want to slow the water down the slope by planting on the contour line to limit soil erosion to an absolute minimum. A contour is a level line that runs at 90 degrees to your slope. Where possible, establish the baseline at 90 degrees off a road or an existing boundary fence or a pathway or wall for efficiency and neatness. However, laying the baseline on the contour always takes priority. Use your 60 centimeter stick to make sure you have tensioned the measuring rope correctly. Establishing permanence. Hammer in permanent pegs at the first marker and the last marker on the upslope side of your 60 centimeter measuring rope. Use 20 centimeter long pegs cut from plastic conduit, steel rods, or hard wooden pegs that won't rot. Hammer them in deeply, leaving just 5 centimeters above the ground so they can't be removed by animals or people. Another really good technique is to fill small plastic bottles with sand and bury them, just leaving the bottle cap above the ground. These permanent pegs at the first and the last marker on the baseline are very important as they guarantee that year after year you can align the measuring rope to them and have the same starting position for permanence into perpetuity. Holing out. The first technology key is do not plow. With single row plants planted widely apart, we simply make holes or planting stations to be able to place the inputs and the seed at the required depth with as little soil disturbance as possible. Organic input holes. Holes for organic inputs such as manure, compost or anthill soil should be 15 centimeters deep, 12 centimeters wide as a hoe head, and 15 centimeters long. Start 15 centimeters downslope from the rope, striking deeper and deeper until you come right up to the rope, digging to a depth of 15 centimeters. This usually takes 5 or 6 strikes. The hole profile is steep on the upslope side and more gentle on the downslope side. Make a neat soil heap downslope, being careful not to throw the soil too far, as then it will interfere with the next 75 centimeter row. Bringing the soil downslope means that the water will be slowed by the hole and then collected like a dam and result in deep penetration right in the plant zone. Inorganic input holes. Holes for inorganic inputs such as DAP or NPK should be just 8 centimeters deep, 12 centimeters wide as a hoe head, and 10 centimeters long. The holes for inorganic fertilizer are shallower as the input volume is far less. Prepare the holes in the same way as we have described with organic inputs. However, start digging just 10 centimeters away from the rope and complete in just 3 strikes. Don't dig the soil upslope, as the soil will be washed straight back into the hole again. Don't dig the soil to the side, as the water will be moving at full pace down the slope when it hits the heap, because it doesn't have the hole to slow it down and will have little benefit in slowing soil movement. Side digging also results in measuring ropes being cut frequently, so stick to the downslope method. Hole spacing. The planting stations are 60 centimeters apart in 75 centimeter rows, which will give us 22,222 holes per hectare. The first planting station should be dug at the first marker and the last one being dug at the last marker, not at the corners. This allows for either the 75 centimeter sticks or the 60 centimeter measuring rope to move on the 75 centimeter measuring ropes to freely go through on the downslope edges. When holing out, move in an organized manner from right to left, spacing the team out evenly to prevent wasting time in leapfrogging over one another. Inspect the planting stations after each row to make sure that the team have dug the holes accurately at 60 centimeter intervals with an even depth and size. Establishing the perfect right angle and corner number 3. At corner 2, place a large square piece of paper in line with the baseline. Attach another rope, either your 75 centimeter measuring rope or an unmarked rope to corner 2, and run it down the slope to the bottom end of the field. With the help of an assistant, adjust the downslope rope until it lines up exactly with the edge of the paper, making a perfect right angle, and hammer in corner peg number 3. You can also use the 3-4-5 method to establish the right angle even more accurately. Pace out the downslope length and divide your field into 3 equal portions with a mark in the soil so that you know where each of the 3 portions start. Establishing the second and subsequent rows. Once you have finished digging planting stations in your first row and laid out your downslope rope in a perfect square, you will be establishing the second row. Both you and your assistant must undo the loops of the baseline rope, leaving both corner pegs 1 and 2 in place. Use a 75 centimeter stick to measure from the center of corner peg 2 in line with the downslope rope, which is your guide, and hammer in a temporary peg for row number 2. If you have made a 75 centimeter measuring rope, just hammer in the peg at the next marker. Attach the loop to the temporary peg of row number 2. Do not remove the corner peg 2 at this stage, as your downslope rope square is still attached to this corner. The corner pegs will only be removed after the completion of the entire field. On the opposite side to the paper square, use a 75 centimeter stick to measure from the center of corner peg 1 downwards. Move the baseline rope downslope 75 centimeters, ensuring that you lift and drop it and pull it taut and straight. Adjust the stick and rope loop until they overlap and hammer in temporary peg for row number 2. Check that your measuring rope markers line up with the planting stations of the first row before digging planting stations at the row number 2. Dig the second row's holes and then move down 75 centimeters again using the same procedure. When holing out with inexperienced people, it's possible for them to cut the rope, which is then very difficult to knot to exactly 60 centimeter intervals, so they must be very careful. Another solution to this is to use the marking technique, where a surface scratch is made at each of the measuring rope markers across the rope length. Once all the holes are marked, then the rope is moved 30 centimeters up the slope out of the way, and the holes can then be dug working from 15 centimeters down the slope and finishing right up against that mark. This protects the rope from getting damaged by hose strikes, which could cut the rope. Continue digging planting stations in each row at 60 by 75 centimeter intervals until both of the first 2 portions are completed. On a field scale, permanent pegs should be placed at the first and last markers after every 10 rows. In this field, we'll be placing permanent pegs at the 11th, 21st, 31st, 41st, 51st and 61st rows to ensure that we will be able to maintain permanence here. By having accurate measuring ropes and permanent pegs, a field matrix is established which allows for planting in the same planting stations year after year. See the section on permanence in the introduction to the 6 technology keys to gain insight into the benefits of permanence. Land preparation for rotation crops. The third technology key of Farming God's Way is to practice biodiversity, which we can accomplish by rotating crops. When you place the downslope rope, you divided your field into 3 equal portions. Once portion 1 and portion 2 have been prepared for the staple grain, maize in this instance, begin preparing the third portion with your rotation crop, which should preferably be a legume. Hammer in the permanent peg at the first and at the last marker across the slope. In year 1, portion 1 and 2 should be planted to maize and the third portion to beans. But in year 2, portion 1 will be planted to beans and 2 and 3 will be planted to maize. In year 3, portion 1 will be maize, portion 2 will be beans, and portion 3 will be maize again. In year 4, the rotation will revert back to exactly as it is now in the first year, with 2 portions of maize followed by beans in portion number 3.
In more tropical climatic regions with 2 rainy seasons per year, practice rotations based on each rainy season instead of on a yearly basis.
This gives each portion a rest from maize crop, which allows for the breaking of the disease cycles, as well as improving soil fertility through nitrogen fixation with the rotating legume crop, and many other benefits which are covered in the section on biodiversity through alternative crops. Don't be deceived into believing that you'll get away with growing the same crop year after year after year after year, just like most people do. You must have the full persuasion to grow a third of your field to an alternative crop for the rotational value, as well as to be able to help spread your market risk. Other legumes you can grow in your 1/3 rotation include groundnuts, soya beans, pigeon peas, or cowpeas, just to name a few. You can also grow other non-leguminous crops such as cotton or sunflower for your rotation. In the chapter Biodiversity through Alternative Crops, there's a lot more information about this. Many of these alternative crops have smaller canopies than maize, and we would not be able to establish canopy cover if we planted them in planting stations. Instead, we plant them in a continuous furrow across the slope on the contour line. Instead of digging planting stations, at the 60 centimeter marks, we simply dig a 10 centimeter deep furrow across the slope.
Use a cheap stretchy rope that you can pull very tight to get straight rows for all your furrow crops, and just extend it beyond the 75 centimeter mark.
Repeat the furrows by measuring with the 75 centimeter sticks row by row until the whole of portion 3 is completed. This field has 60 rows with 40 rows of planting stations for maize and 20 rows of furrows for beans. Place permanent pegs in rows 51 and the last row again at the first and last markers. After completing all the planting stations and furrows, you can remove the corner pegs, leaving only the permanent pegs in their place. If you have an irregularly shaped field, complete the preparation of planting stations and furrows in the largest square first. Then hyperextend those lines 1 row at a time to fill in the remaining fringe areas as shown in the diagram. Remember, you can't manage what you don't measure. Once you've completed digging your planting stations and furrows, count and record them as well as the number of rows per portion. These numbers are very important for costing and planning ahead. Look at the work of your hands and enjoy it. This order comes into what was once chaos, just like the order that God wants to restore in our lives. Solomon wisely speaks of the joy of good hard work, and we can enjoy our garden's beautiful matrix of in rows, rows, and if you look carefully, even diagonals. Farmers should be able to lift up their heads and be proud of the work of their hands. Correcting acidic soils. In some soil types, usually ones that are reddish in color and where the rainfall is high, there is a tendency for the soil to become acidic. These acidic soils bind nutrients that are necessary for plant growth, making them unavailable to the plants, hereby causing nutrient deficiencies and low yields. Wood ash, bone meal and lime will all increase soil pH, making it more neutral, which will allow for nutrients to be more easily absorbed by the roots, which in turn means higher yields. The most readily available resource for communities to adjust soil pH is wood ash, which is typically just thrown away. Wood ash is also beneficial in that it supplies the soil with essential potassium and many micronutrients. Apply the wood ash by placing a heaped tablespoon in the bottom of every single planting station, or spreading it evenly across a 60 centimeter line in the furrow. Bone meal can be used as an alternative to wood ash in the same way. However, the pH effect of bone meal takes longer. Bone meal is an excellent source of phosphate and is often just another resource that is simply thrown away. Agricultural lime is much more basic than wood ash or bone meal, so apply a flat teaspoon or 5 milliliters instead of a tablespoon. Building lime is not recommended for agricultural use. Once you've counted the number of planting stations, you can calculate the volumes you need. For example, if you've got 10,000 holes times 15 milliliters divided by 1,000 times 0.76, which is the bulk density of wood ash, divided by 50, that equals 2.3 50 kilogram bags of wood ash required. We recommend that you apply wood ash, bone meal or lime for at least 3 years, and thereafter do trials of rows with it and without it to observe the visual benefits in your plants. Over the years, the need to correct soil acidity will become less and less due to the fact that we are not plowing, increasing soil organic matter and using 100% cover with God's blanket. Inputs. God has provided each farmer with a measure of talents. To some He gave 1, others 2 talents, others 5 talents. You need to be faithful with whatever He has given you in your hand, not looking to what you don't have, but rather looking to what you do have. We have to learn to give to get out of this dependency syndrome. We cannot keep taking and taking and taking without giving something back. The Bible says you will reap what you sow. We must change our mindset to become aligned to God's ways. 0 times 0 equals 0, and 0 times 100 still equals 0. If you give nothing even to good potential soil, you will get nothing. Uganda, Malawi and Mozambique have beautiful deep soils, and the people's mindset is we don't need to put any inputs in as our soils are so fertile, but in reality they are getting very low yields. We will reap according to the measure that we sow. Every season, the crop's removing nutrients from the soil, and we must give back to replenish that loss. Organic inputs. When using manure, compost or anthill soil, and you are not going to use a top dressing, then place 500 mils in the bottom of the 15 centimeter deep holes. We realize that most small-scale farmers cannot afford to get access to urea or ammonium nitrate, and so it is far better to sow bountifully with 500 mils from the very beginning. Make sure that each hole receives the same amount of inputs so that you can get even stands that close canopy early. So maintain very high standards when applying inputs. Uneven stands cause non-beneficial competition, as the worst weed in your field is another maize plant. If you counter the planting stations in your field, then you can calculate your input needs. By example, using manure or compost with no top dressing, 10,000 holes times 500 mils divided by 1,000 divided by 50 is equal to 150 kilogram bags, or 8 Scotch carts. When placing your inputs for the bean rows, spread 500 mils in the furrow every meter. Manure. When using manure, use what you have in your hand, meaning whatever is available to you, but try to use the freshest manure that you can find, as this will have the highest nitrogen content. It is perfectly safe to use fresh manure because of the 3 centimeter soil separation layer applied in the next step. Generally, a sliding scale of manure quality would start with chicken, then bird, then pig, then horse, then cattle, then goats, then sheep. But this also depends on what the animals are eating. Where manure is limited, rather use the manure to make high quality Farming God's Way compost, which always outperforms manure. Compost. When referring to compost, that is Farming God's Way compost, which is both aerobic and thermophilic and made with specific ingredients and ratios. Where possible, make your compost close to the field so it does not have to be transported a long distance. Anthill soil. Anthill soil is harvested from ant heaps and starting from the outside edges and cutting into them with a hoe or pick, then breaking down the clods into a crumbly texture. Anthill soil has a very high clay content and a higher potassium and organic matter content than the surrounding soil. It is also full of a vast biodiversity of beneficial microbes, which are valuable for re-inoculating our soils and bringing them back to life again. The Farming God's Way comparative trials conducted over many years in Port Elizabeth show consistent yields of 6 to 8 tons per hectare, which is 160 bags with 500 mils of manure and no top dressing. 7 to 9 tons a hectare is achieved, which is 180 50 kilogram bags per hectare with 500 mils of compost with no top dressing. Some small-scale Farming God's Way farmers have achieved up to 3 tons a hectare, which is 60 50 kilogram bags per hectare with anthill soil alone. The yield average in the African continent among small-scale farmers is around 0.35 tons per hectare, which is just 7 50 kilogram bags in southern African countries and just 15 bags in the more tropical central regions. And so we can comfortably go more than 10 times better with these simple, proven and available solutions. The 3 organic input types we encourage all build up our soil microbial life and fertility. They improve the soil texture, structure and the soil's ability to hold moisture and are much more preferable and cost effective than using inorganic fertilizer. Inorganic fertilizer inputs. Our primary focus is on the extension of organic input types, and most small-scale farmers have no access to inorganic fertilizer because of its high cost and the remoteness of their areas. But they do sometimes get given fertilizer vouchers or bags and should therefore know how to use it wisely. In many African countries, people are scared of using them, having been given false information. Like with most things, it's not its use, but its abuse, which will have a very negative effect on the soil. Remember, in large-scale commercial farming systems, it's nearly impossible to give back the volumes of nutrients removed by the crop and get very high yields. And so there is a place for fertilizer. Fertilizer come in 2 types, basal and top dressings. The basal types include DAP or diammonium phosphate and NPK in varying ratios. They have a balance of nutrients and are made up of nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. Basal fertilizers get placed in the bottom of the holes. Top dressing types have mostly got nitrogen in them. They get buried just below the ground surface and include CAN or calcium ammonium nitrate and urea. For optimal yields, place a flat tablespoon or 12 mils of DAP in a narrow band across the bottom of each hole. An example to calculate the inorganic fertilizer requirements is 10,000 holes times 12 milliliters times 1.1, which is the bulk density of DAP, equals 132 kilograms or 3 bags of DAP. If you are using inorganic fertilizer for your bean rotation, simply spread the heaped teaspoon or 8 mils evenly every meter in the furrow. Only prepare land areas that you can put correct inputs into, and don't be tempted to spread your inputs thinly over a larger area. If you only have limited amounts of inputs, rather use what you have on a smaller area and do it to a high standard than doing a large portion to a very low standard. Covering to seed depth. Cover all the inputs with a 3 centimeter soil separation layer as soon as possible, using soil from the downslope soil heap. This separation layer is very, very important to prevent the seed from being burnt by the inputs, especially when using fresh manure. The separation layer also allows you to get the exact planting depth, which for maize is 5 centimeters or a matchbox length. Your bean rows needs a final planting depth of 3 centimeters deep, a matchbox on its side, so cover leaving this depth remaining. Covering the inputs with this 3 centimeter separation layer also prevents the loss of nitrogen to the atmosphere through volatilization. And so it is very important to complete covering inputs as a part of your plant readiness preparations before the onset of the rains. Waiting for the rains. No matter where you are in the world, your field should be ready for planting at least 3 weeks before the optimal planting time in your area. This way you are sure of being on time, especially if you have good early rains. In the summer rainfall regions such as South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique and Malawi, you should be at plant readiness by the end of October, having dug your holes and placed your inputs and covered with a 3 centimeter separation layer of soil in readiness for the 10th to the 25th of November optimal planting date. In the central region where the long rains of Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda and Uganda are dominant, you should have plant readiness by the end of February in readiness for mid-March planting. We strongly recommend that farmers do not practice dry planting, which involves the planting of seeds before the rains actually come. If you have early rains that are just sufficient for germination and then have a dry spell, you'll have to replant again, wasting seed, time and effort. You must wait for sufficient rains before planting. Planting. We advocate that small-scale farmers use open pollinated variety seed as opposed to genetically modified or hybrid seed. They perform at much the same yield under suboptimal conditions and are much cheaper, and the same seed can be stored at the end of the season and replanted for many, many years. OPVs can be stored simply and effectively by first getting them to the correct moisture content, then mixing some wood ash with them at a ratio of 10%. And storing them in bags in a cool, dry place. This prevents both fungal and insect post-harvest storage problems. We heartily discourage the planting of genetically modified or hybrid seed, which must be bought every single year. The poor get yoked into government and seed company schemes with these seed types and usually become seed aid dependents. The poor should be free to be able to plant when they're ready to plant and not yoked to men, governments or organizations. If you have to buy in seed, then buy the best open pollinated variety that you can afford in the very first season. When you're ready to plant and have had sufficient rain, take the amount of maize seed you can plant at one time and pre-soak it for 6 hours to allow the seed to be able to take up water and swell. Place 3 seeds per planting station neatly in the row, one on the left, one in the middle, and one on the right hand side. The seeds are planted at 5 centimeters deep, which is a matchbox length, and also a matchbox down the slope. If you come across a hole that is too full of soil, then simply press the seed to the correct depth with your finger. Plant the seeds 5 centimeters away from the top side of the holes, as that is the deepest part of the planting station. When planting beans, place the bean seed at 10 centimeter intervals along the row, 3 centimeters deep. These are all part of the high standards that are going to give God glory in our fields. Covering the seed. Cover the seed with fine loose soil from the downslope heap. Making sure that you don't cover them with stones, heavy clods or God's blankets. All of these can result in poor germination rates and uneven stands, so take good care at this point. Cover evenly with no depressions. These depressions can cause problems as pools of water develop here after heavy rains, and seedlings could get diseases such as damping off, as their stems will be right in the water. Cover level or preferably leave a slightly raised surface for good germination. Applying God's blanket. If you go to God's garden, which is anywhere where there is no intervention by man, you'll see that He, in His wisdom, puts a protective covering of leaves and twigs and fruits and decaying grasses. And these lie on top of the ground, gradually decomposing over many, many years. We call this mulch God's blanket. It protects the soil from erosion, allows for deep penetration of rainfall, the conservation of moisture. It improves soil fertility. Crops have improved drought tolerance and an ideal growing environment, amongst many other advantages. All of this leads to significantly improved yields. Aim for 100% cover, which is 2.5 centimeters thick in your fields. And although it may take you a few years to get there, do this with all of your heart. In the beginning, your only plant material available for God's blanket is weeds and old crop residues. So do whatever you can to increase your blanket coverage by cutting grasses or banana leaves, carrying in forest mulch, or even collecting your neighbor's crop residues before they get burnt. Cover the whole field evenly, even over the maize planting stations. The maize seeds will germinate right through the blanket, so don't fear. When planting all other seeded crops, you should take care to leave a narrow 5 centimeter space over the seeded rows to allow for germination to take place, after which the blanket can be brought right up against the plant bases. God's blanket is so important, it cannot be emphasized enough. We need to see God's blanket as white gold, the treasure of the soil, so guard it and build it up. After approximately 7 to 10 days, the maize seedlings will emerge through God's blanket. The seedlings usually emerge slightly slower through God's blanket due to cooler soil temperatures. But don't panic, as they soon catch up and overtake seedlings in fields where the blanket is not present. It is not how you start the race which counts, but how you finish. Gapping. Sometimes chickens, guinea fowl or rats dig out the seed, causing fairly large empty spaces, which we can correct by gapping. This is done shortly after emergence. Gapping of maize is only done when you have several empty planting stations and not when one is empty. Take the amount of maize seed you need and pre-soak it for 6 hours to allow it to take up water and swell. Then push the seeds down to 5 centimeters or a matchbox length into existing holes and close them over. Gapping fills any empty spaces in your field. To ensure homogeneous stands and good canopy cover, be on time with this step. First, weeding. Weeds significantly lower crop yields because they compete with plants for water, nutrients, light and space. Weeds are stimulated to germinate by disturbance of the soil, by scratching of the seed coat and exposure to sunlight. Farming God's way counteracts these stimuli by not ploughing and only having a minimal soil disturbance. 100% cover with God's blanket, that's 2.5 centimeters thick, which minimizes exposure to sunlight. Plants at 60 by 75 centimeter spacing, which effectively cuts out light by closing the canopy from as early as 5 weeks, hereby reducing the weed seed exposure to sunlight even further. If you have collected and stored supplementary blankets, then put it down when the seedlings are around 20 to 30 centimeters tall to get 100% cover and 2.5 centimeters thick. If you do this step, you will not need to do any weeding throughout the growing cycle. By way of example, we've not weeded our comparative gardens for 5 years now. Weeding is an enormous cost to farmers, and along with ploughing costs, they can even make farming unviable. So you're encouraged to stop weeding altogether and to use God's blanket and cover cropping techniques in the off-season instead. These are not only beneficial for weed control, but they also have many other benefits too. See the chapter 20 Reasons Why We Do the How. If your blanket is insufficient or decomposed to become like a sheet, then do your first weeding when the weeds are still small, around 3 centimeters tall, which is usually 10 to 14 days after planting. When weeds are weeded out at this white hair stage, they are very easy to cut off and cannot regrow. Weed by walking backwards, simply hoeing them off at the soil surface and leaving them to add to God's blanket. Pull out any creeping grasses and carry them out of the field, but try to disturb as little soil as possible. Repeat the weeding process on time every 10 to 14 days. An example is a Farming God's Way farmer weeding the weeds when they're just 3 centimeters tall will complete a hectare by working less than 5 hours a day for 7 days. But the lazy farmer says, I'll do this weeding tomorrow. He waits for the weeds to get to 30 centimeters tall, and because they are so big and the job is so much more difficult, it will take him 14 days to do the same hectare, which is twice as long. The weed cycle is a 10-day cycle, so the weeds will be 4 days bigger than when he first started by the time he finishes. He will always be behind with his weeding, lose his joy, and have a significantly lower yield. Sin and weeds have a lot in common. When you're tempted to sin and you deal with that temptation at that small root hair stage, it cannot bear bad fruit. But if you leave temptation unattended for just a few moments, its fruit will leave you in disgrace. In the same way, weed your fields when the weeds are tiny, and never let weeds set seed in your field, as they will produce hundreds of thousands of seeds which can remain dormant in the soil for 20 years, waiting for the right conditions for germination. Just 1 year of poor weed control can result in 7 years of weed problems. Weed control is a major contributor to crop losses and even failure, and many farmers rarely understand just how important it really is. Keep your lands weed-free throughout the year by doing things on time, doing it to a high standard, which will result in minimal wastage of your time and effort and make a big difference to your sustainable profitability. Thinning. Maize achieves optimally at 44,444 plants per hectare in most cases, and to achieve this with 22,222 planting stations per hectare, we should only have 2 plants per planting station. So why did we plant 3 when we actually only want 2? Seed is only certified to around 87% germination. So if we had planted 44,444 plants, only about 38,000 would have come up, excluding losses from rats or chickens or guinea fowls, which leaves probably around 35,000 plants per hectare. Because of this, it is impossible to get our optimal yield potential unless we plant 3 seeds per hole and thin them down to just 2. It has been proven that for every cent you spend on the 3rd seed, you will get back 40 cents through the thinning process. That is a 40 times cost to benefit ratio, so it's really worthwhile doing this. Thin at 2 to 3 weeks after emergence when seedlings are around 20 to 30 centimeters tall. You do this by uprooting the weakest plant, or if they are all the same size, then the middle plant of each hole's emerged seedlings. Look at 3 holes at a time, not 1, and thin to 6 seedlings per 3 planting stations. In this example, we have 3 plus 3 plus 1, which makes 7 plants in the 3 planting stations. We only want 6. So I will thin out the weakest of this first planting station by uprooting the whole plant and leaving it as God's blanket. That makes 2 plus 3 plus 1, which is 6 for the 3 planting stations. In this example, we have 3, 3, and 3, and so we only want 6 and we've got 9, so we need to remove 3 plants. So in this example, we'll remove the weakest of them, uprooting it, adding it to God's blanket. In this example, it's the middle of these, and this last one is the weakest of these. And we end up with 6 plants over the 3 planting stations. In this example, we have 3 plants, 0 in this planting station and 3 in this planting station. So we will leave all 6 of these plants remaining. First top dress. Dry manure, compost or anthill soil are not useful for top dressing, as the nitrogen is released into plant usable form too late to be of benefit to the current crop growth. Rather apply these dry inputs as a basal dressing in 500 ml volumes at the beginning. Then you do not need to apply either of the top dressings. Our trials have proven that small-scale farmers can excel by increasing the basal dressing to 500 milliliters and not applying any top dressing. If you applied a basal inorganic fertilizer or just 350 ml of organic inputs and can afford it, then do your top dressing immediately after thinning at about 2 to 3 weeks after emergence. Options for top dressing include manure tea. Make a liquid form of manure by adding a spadeful of fresh manure to a 10-liter bucket of water and stir it until it is a dark color. Apply 350 ml on the upslope side and 1 hand width away from each planting station several times before tasseling, being careful to avoid contact with the stems or the leaves. Ammonium nitrate or urea fertilizer. Apply the top dressing while working in pairs. The first person makes the small 3 centimeter deep holes with a sharp stick 1 hand width away on the upslope side of each planting station. The hole position is very important to avoid burning the seedlings. The second person follows closely behind, placing a heaped teaspoon, 8 ml, of urea or LAN in each of the prepared holes, then uses their foot to close the small hole before moving to the next one. Working in pairs makes this step very quick and accurate. This method prevents nitrogen losses to the atmosphere as the top dressing is in the ground and covered. There must be good residual soil moisture or rainfall for the top dressing to become available to the plant. Second and third weeding. It is always preferable to continue to build up the blanket coverage and smother mulch small weeds throughout the growing season instead of weeding. And it is so rewarding to see the reduction in weed growth when you have a good blanket in place. If you need to weed, then do so every 10 to 14 days, weeding backwards when the weeds are still tiny at 3 centimeters tall. You will most likely have to do 2 or 3 weedings before canopy stage if you do not have a high standard blanket in place. Full canopy. At about 6 weeks, your plants will be at about waist high, and because of the 60 by 75 centimeter spacing, they will close the canopy completely. This allows the leaves to capture the maximum amount of sunlight for good growth, shades out weeds, establishes an ideal environment for good competition between plants, and creates a productive microclimate inside the canopy. Desuckering. Suckers sometimes branch off the parent plant at ground level, especially when there's a lot of nitrogen available to them. Some advisors say they should be removed, but surprisingly this is not proven to make any difference to the yield. If you want to do desuckering for neatness sake, simply snap off the suckers with a quick motion before your second top dress. Second top dressing. If you applied 500 ml of organic inputs as a basal dressing, then it is not essential to top dress. For example, in our field, we put 500 ml down, and so we are not going to top dress at this stage. However, it is recommended if you applied a basal inorganic fertilizer of just 350 ml of organic inputs and you can afford it. The second top dressing should be applied at the piping stage, when the maize just starts to show the tassel coming through the top of the funnel, usually at about 8 weeks after emergence. Option 1, manure tea. Apply 350 ml on the upslope side and 1 hand width away from each planting station. Option 2, apply 5 ml or a flat teaspoonful of either ammonium nitrate or urea. First, make a small 3 centimeter deep hole with a stick, 1 hand width on the upslope side of each planting station to ensure you don't burn the plants. Then place the teaspoonful in the hole and cover it with soil using your foot to prevent nitrogen loss to the atmosphere. Pollination and seed fill. In a maize plant, there is an interesting biological phenomena where every single ovule has an individual silk, the long golden brown colored thread which comes through the top of the cob. During the pollination phase of the plant, a single pollen grain lands on the silk and grows down the silk until it comes into contact with the ovule, where it fertilizes it to form a seed. The silks which attach to the bottom rows of ovules emerge first and therefore get pollinated first, and the maize cob will gradually fill going upwards until the topmost seeds are filled. However, the silks need to be moist in order for pollination to take place, otherwise the pollen cannot grow through the silk's tube. If the silks dry off through insufficient available moisture during this stage of the crop, then significant crop losses can occur. So moisture conservation is critical during the pollination phase. Pre-harvest cover cropping, relay cropping, or late weeding. The maize plant is usually physiologically mature between 90 to 120 days and then begins to dry off and die back. The leaves fold up, and for the first time since canopy closure, light will penetrate through the canopy. If there is some rainfall at this drying off stage or enough residual soil moisture, then it is highly recommended to plant a cover crop at this time. They can be sown by broadcasting suitable cover crop seed under the canopy, after which a light shaking of the blanket or a surface weeding will allow for there to be sufficient cover crop seed to soil contact and germination. Cover crops have many benefits such as weed control, nitrogen fixation with legumes, soil improvements and biodiversity, just to name a few. See the section Alternative Crops for more information. Many Farming Godso farmers capitalize on the residual moisture by planting relay crops like cowpeas or pigeon peas at this stage. The relay crops do really well because of the shade effects early on in their growth cycle. At harvest time, these relay crops are already around 30 centimeters tall and strong enough to be able to manage the disturbance of post-harvest stalk lodging. These relay crops can be planted because of the conservation of the moisture under God's blanket and allow farmers to gain a second harvest in a place where they would only typically have received one. Relay crops also have benefits besides a second harvest, including weed control, nitrogen fixation with legumes, biodiversity, and the right to protect against animal grazing. However, they do not have the same long-term soil benefits as cover crops, as there is a net extraction of nutrients out of the soil. See the section Alternative Crops and Relay Cropping later. If there is insufficient blanket cover after physiological maturity, then the sunlight penetrating through the canopy will stimulate weed growth, as there's still some residual moisture left in the soil. Most farmers make the mistake of leaving this last late weeding, and they end up harvesting in a jungle of weeds like blackjacks and burrs that stick in their clothing and buffalo beans that burn their skin. The harvest, which is supposed to be a joyful experience, is now a misery. A light weeding at this late stage will allow for the harvest to be done with joy and also ensure a weed-free stand in the off-season. If you want to encourage your crops to dry off quicker, which is especially helpful in wetter areas, then you can do topping. Snap off the uppermost part of the stalks above the cobs, which will effectively kill the plant, and the cobs will dry off a lot faster. Harvest time.
Let your glory fill this land, faith. Oh, you know that the blessings are coming, Jesus. You are the way, you are the way, Jesus.
Harvest when your maize is physiologically mature, usually 2 months after tasseling. The stalks will look very dry and the cobs will most probably be hanging down. The seeds will be well dented, glassy, and too hard to scratch with your nail and be at about 30% moisture content. If you hammer seeds at this stage, they will usually just splatter. First, harvest your OPV or open pollinated variety seeds from your most healthy plants with the very best cobs. Make sure you keep these separate from the other cobs and dry, shell, treat and store them very carefully for next season's replanting. Thereafter, harvest your remaining cobs and store them in a safe, dry, sunny place around your house or on the rooftop or on a drying rack until they are properly dried out, which is at about 13% moisture content. If you hammer seeds at this stage, they will usually shatter and they are only then ready to be shelled. Treat the shelled maize to keep weevils and other pests out by dusting with wood ash, lacing with neem leaves or adding storage tablets and then bag. When using wood ash for storage, we recommend a 10% volume mixed in thoroughly, but make sure the maize moisture level is correct first. When using neem leaves, first line your bags with the green leaves and after each 20 to 30 centimeter layer of shelled maize, add more leaves until the bags are full. Traditionally, post-harvest stalk lodging is not commonly done. Instead, the stalks are left standing upright in the fields or grazed shorter by cattle. This is the single biggest cause of stalk borer pest infestation in maize fields being so high. Stalk borer is responsible for about 25% of the yield losses in maize fields annually, and yet we can control it if we understand its life cycle. Stalk borer starts off as a pupa at the start of each season. It then becomes a moth which lays eggs on the stems. The eggs hatch into worms which bore through the stems, leaving their trademark breathing holes on the sides of the stalks. They then pupate after 27 days and the whole life cycle starts over again. This cycle happens several times during the growing season of the maize plant, but at the end of the season, the pupa form at the crown of the plant on the coolest, shady side at the soil surface. If we knock down the stalks, we expose the pupa to UV radiation and heat, and it dries them out. This simple practice, along with the opportunistic feeding of ants, birds, and decomposing bacteria, significantly reduces stalk borer infestation. Interestingly enough, grazing down alone has proven to be inadequate in the reduction of stalk borer incidence, as the crown is still left intact. This stresses the importance of not cutting or grazing down the stalks, but rather knocking them down completely. Knock down the stalks backwards by kicking them off at the crown, laying them neatly in the rows at about 30 degrees to the row line, so they can be easily worked when doing land preparation next season. These stalks are our new blanket or mulch, so don't burn them and do your best to protect them from animals. Next season, we'll plant into these maize stalks, which would have decomposed quite significantly. Field layout summary. Fields should be divided into 3 equal portions, 2 portions maize and 1 portion of beans in this example. Row intervals are 75 centimeters going down the slope with permanence established at the first and last measuring rope markers. The 3 equal portions should then be divided further with permanence not exceeding 10 rows to guarantee permanence. Maize is planted in planting stations which are a hoe width or 12 centimeters wide and a hand depth or 15 centimeters deep when using manure, compost or anthill soil, or alternatively 8 centimeters deep when using fertilizer and 60 centimeters apart across the slope. After 2/3 of the field has been prepared with planting stations for maize, prepare 10 centimeter deep furrows across the slope for beans in the remaining portion. Rotate these portions each year. In more tropical climatic regions with 2 rainy seasons per year, practice rotations based on each rainy season instead of on a yearly basis. Summary of inputs. To correct acidic soils with maize, place a heaped tablespoon of wood ash or a teaspoon of lime in the bottom of each planting station. Next, place 500 ml of manure or compost or anthill soil in the bottom of each planting station. Cover with a 3 cm soil separation layer, leaving a 5 cm depth for planting, and wait for the rains. To correct acidic soils with beans, place a heaped tablespoon of wood ash or a teaspoon of lime every 60 cm in the furrows. Next, place 500 ml of manure or compost or anthill soil in the furrow every meter. Cover with a 3 cm soil separation layer, leaving a 3 cm depth for planting, and wait for the rains. Summary of the growing cycle. Plant 3 maize seeds in each planting station, 1 on the left, 1 in the middle, and 1 on the right at 5 centimeters deep, then cover level. Gap the field shortly after emergence. At 20 centimeters tall, thin to an average of 2 seedlings per planting station, or 6 plants every 3 planting stations. If basil dressing was only 350 ml, then top dress with manure tea or urea at 30 centimeters tall and again at piping. 10 centimeters on the upslope side of each hole. Ensure the blanket is at 100% cover and 2.5 centimeters thick year-round, and always keep your fields weed-free. Harvest when the cobs have dried off properly. Do post-harvest stalk lodging to add to the blanket cover and to control stalk borer. Plant bean seeds 3 centimeters deep and 10 centimeters apart in the furrows. Cover level or preferably leave a slightly raised surface for good germination. Leave a 5 centimeter gap with no blanket on top until after germination. Thereafter, ensure 100% cover with God's blanket, which is 2.5 centimeters thick, keeping lands weed-free throughout the year. As you have seen with your eyes and heard with your ears, I trust that you would have the courage to implement farming God's way wholeheartedly, and that you would see the manifest glory of God come in your farm fields as you practice farming God's way and honor the first and master farmer with the work of your hands. Proverbs chapter 3 verse 5 and 6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all of your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all of your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight."
The promises, walk in it, shine bright, let your glory fill this land. Faith, hope, you know that the blessings are coming. Jesus, you are